When we think of medieval punishment, we often picture a swift execution, a hanging, a beheading with an end. But for many, the sentence was not death. It was something else. It was a judgment designed to be lived with. This was the world of mutilation. Mutilation wasn't just random, chaotic violence. It was a system, it was a language. The authorities used the human body as a canvas, a billboard to display the consequences of breaking the law. A person's punishment was carved directly into their flesh. It was a permanent record of their crime, visible to everyone they would ever meet. This was a society where most people couldn't read, but everyone could read a missing hand, a slit nose, or an empty eye socket. The message was simple and brutal. This is what happens when you cross us. You have to understand the mindset. Justice was not a private affair. It was public theater. Executions, whippings, and mutilations happened in the town square, often on market day. The goal was to make the biggest possible impact on the community. It was a deterrent. The sight of a man with his hands cut off, begging for scraps, was a more powerful warning against theft than any written law. It was a daily reminder. The body was seen differently then. It wasn't just a personal vessel. It was part of the community, and it was subject to the king's law. If you committed a crime, you had, in a sense, forfeited the rights to your own body. The state could then use it to make a point. They could take a piece of you. They could reshape you into a symbol of their power. It was a profound act of control. They weren't just punishing a person, they were unmaking them. They were taking away the parts that made them whole, the parts they used to work, to interact with the world, to be seen as normal. And the variety of mutilations was wide. It was a grim vocabulary of pain. Hands were removed for theft. Tongues were cut out for blasphemy or perjury. Noses were slit for adultery. Ears were cropped for lesser crimes. Eyes were gouged out for spying or poaching in the king's forest. Each punishment was chosen for its symbolic weight. The punishment didn't just hurt the body, it mirrored the crime itself. The hand that stole was the hand that was taken. The tongue that lied was the tongue that was silenced. This wasn't seen as unusually cruel by the standards of the day. It was logical. It was part of a legal framework known as lex talionis's, the law of retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In a world without a widespread prison system, this was a practical solution. You couldn't afford to house and feed thousands of criminals for years on end. A quick, sharp, and permanent punishment solved the problem. It dealt with the offender and sent a message to everyone else, all in one public, bloody spectacle. But it was more than just practicality, it was about shame. A quick death could be honorable in some circumstances. So mutilation was never honorable. It was a mark of deep disgrace. It forced the person to live with their shame every single day. They became an outcast. They were physically marked as a sinner or criminal. People would see them and know what they did. Children might point. Adults would shun them. Their crime became their identity. So when we talk about medieval mutilation, we are not just talking about pain. We are talking about a form of social control. We are talking about a legal system that wrote its laws on the skin, muscle, and bone of its people. It was a brutal, visual, and deeply personal form of justice. It was designed to break not only the body but the spirit, and to turn a human being into a walking, breathing lesson for all to see. The person was no longer just a person. They were a message. The logic of medieval mutilation was brutally simple. The punishment should fit the crime, not just in severity, but in form. The part of the body that committed the sin was the part that was forfeit. This wasn't just about causing pain, it was about a dark, poetic justice that everyone in the town square could understand. Let's start with the most common crime theft. A thief's most important tool is his hands. The hands that reach out, that grasp, that take what isn't theirs. So the law took the hands. For a first offense, it might be the right hand. For a repeat offender, both. The procedure was crude. The hand was placed on a wooden block. The executioner, often the local blacksmith with his strong arm and heavy tools, would use a chisel and mallet or a heavy axe. One sharp blow. The hand was gone. To stop the bleeding, the stump was often plunged into boiling pitch or seared with a red-hot iron. The pain is unimaginable, but the purpose was clear. You can no longer steal, and everyone who sees you knows you are a thief. You are marked for life. Then there was the crime of bearing false witness, lying under oath, perjury. In a society that relied heavily on spoken words and oaths, this was a serious offense. It undermined the very foundation of justice. The tool of the perjurer is the tongue. So, the law demanded the tongue. The methods were horrific. Sometimes the tongue was simply pulled out with a pair of pincers and cut off at the base with a knife. Other times, a hot iron was used to burn it out. The person, if they survived, was silenced forever. They could no longer spread lies. They could no longer speak at all. Their punishment was a literal and permanent silencing, a physical manifestation of their untrustworthiness. Poaching was another serious crime, especially on royal or noble lands. The deer, boar, and other game were the property of the lord. To hunt them was to steal directly from the powerful. The poacher's crime was one of sight. He used his eyes to track the animal, to aim his bow. The punishment, therefore, was blinding. This was often done with a red-hot poker or a thumb gouge, a specialized tool designed to scoop the eye from its socket. It was a punishment that not only ended the poacher's career, but also cast him into a world of total darkness. He was stripped of his livelihood and his independence. He could no longer see the forest he had stolen from. Sexual crimes, like adultery or rape, often carried punishments aimed at the source of the lust. For men, this meant castration. The removal of the testicles was a complete and total humiliation. It robbed a man of his perceived masculinity, his ability to have children, his place in the patriarchal order. It was a physical and social unmaking. For women accused of adultery, the punishment was often facial mutilation. The nose was a common target. A slit or completely removed nose was a mark of a shameful woman. It destroyed her beauty, her public face. In a world where a woman's value was often tied to her appearance and her marriage prospects, this was a devastating sentence. It marked her as unchaste, untrustworthy, and ruined. Even lesser crimes had their corresponding cuts. Forgery, the act of creating false documents, could be punished by chopping off the fingers that held the pen. Spreading gossip or slander could lead to having your ears cropped. It was a way of saying, you did not listen to good counsel, so you will no longer have the ears to listen at all. Each cut, each burn, each removal was a sentence in a story. The body of the criminal became a text that told the tale of their transgression. This system was terrifyingly direct. There was no ambiguity. The link between the act and the consequence was physical and undeniable. It removed the abstract nature of law and made it terrifyingly real. The pain and the disfigurement were not just byproducts of the punishment, they were the point. They were meant to sear the lesson into the mind of the victim and the memory of the crowd. The crime and the cut were one and the same. The act of mutilation was a raw, physical business. It was not performed in a sterile room by a trained surgeon. It happened out in the open, on a raised scaffold in the middle of a crowd. And the man tasked with the job was not a doctor, but an executioner. He was a craftsman of a different sort. His tools were not for healing, but for breaking. The tools of the trade were simple, often borrowed from other professions. There were no specialized instruments designed for humane removal. The executioner used what worked. For amputating a hand or foot, a heavy, sharp axe or a meat cleaver was common. The limb would be placed on a solid wooden block, much like a butcher's block. The executioner needed strength and a steady hand. A single, clean blow was considered a mark of skill. A botched job requiring multiple chops only added to the horror and the suffering. It could also turn the crowd against the executioner for his incompetence. For smaller, more precise work, different tools were required. Knives of various sizes were used for slitting noses, cropping ears, or cutting out tongues. Pincers, large and iron, were used to get a firm grip on a tongue or to pull out teeth. For blinding, a small sharp dagger could be used to pierce the eyeball. More often, though, it was done with heat. A poker, left in a brazier of hot coals until it glowed red, would be pressed directly into the eye. The sizzle and the smell of burning flesh would have filled the air. Another method was the thumb gouge, a cruel metal scoop used to pry the eye from its socket. There was no anesthetic. The person was fully conscious, fully aware of every second. They were often tied or held down by several strong men. Their screams were part of the spectacle. Pain was not something to be minimized. It was a central component of the punishment. It was seen as a purifying force, a penance for the crime committed. The agony was part of the justice. After the cut was made, the immediate problem was bleeding. Medieval people had a rudimentary understanding of the body. They knew that uncontrolled bleeding led to death. The standard method for stopping it, or cauterizing the wound, was as brutal as the mutilation itself. For an amputated limb, the stump would be plunged into a bucket of boiling tar or pitch. The shock and the searing pain would be immense, but it would seal the blood vessels. Another method was to use a flat piece of iron heated in the fire until it was glowing and press it against the open wound. This cauterization, while agonizing, was the only thing that gave the person a chance of survival. Infection was the next great danger. The tools were dirty. The executioner's hands were dirty. The public square was filthy. There was no concept of germs or sterilization. The wound, even if cauterized, was a gateway for bacteria. Many people who survived the initial mutilation would die days or weeks later from a raging infection. Gangrene was common. A fever would set in, and the person would waste away. Surviving the punishment was a matter of sheer luck and a strong constitution. The executioner himself was a strange figure in society. He was both necessary and despised. People feared him. He lived on the margins of town, often shunned. His work was considered unclean. Yet, he was a state official, paid to carry out the law. A good executioner was valued for his efficiency. He was expected to be strong, stoic, and immune to the horror of his daily work. He was the physical instrument of the state's power, the man who turned a legal sentence into a physical reality. His hands were the ones that held the knife, the poker, the axe. His work was to deconstruct human bodies, piece by piece, in full view of the public, turning people into lessons. The sounds, the smells, and the sights of his work were a fundamental part of the medieval justice system. The punishment did not end when the executioner's axe fell or the hot iron was pulled away. For those who survived, that was just the beginning of a new, terrible life. The mutilation was a permanent brand. It was a sentence with no release date. The person was transformed into a walking warning, a living testament to the power of the law. Imagine trying to live without a hand. Simple tasks become monumental challenges. Eating, dressing, washing. If both hands were taken, survival was nearly impossible without constant help. Work, especially the manual labor that most people performed, was out of the question. A farmer cannot till a field. A blacksmith cannot swing a hammer. A woman cannot spin thread. The mutilation was not just a physical loss, it was an economic death sentence. With their ability to work gone, most of the mutilated had only one option: begging. They became a common sight on the streets of medieval towns and on the steps of churches. They would display their scarred stumps, their empty eye sockets, their disfigured faces. Their very presence was a performance of their punishment. They didn't even need to speak of their crime, their bodies told the story. "See what I have done," their appearance said, "and see what was done to me. Do not make the same mistake." They were a constant visible deterrent. Society's reaction was complex. On one hand, there was a degree of Christian charity. People were encouraged to give alms to the poor and unfortunate. A mutilated beggar might receive a few coins or a piece of bread out of pity or a sense of religious duty. But on the other hand, there was fear and revulsion. These were marked criminals. They were physically and socially unclean. People would shun them. They were outcasts, living on the absolute fringes of society. Children might taunt them. They would be denied entry to respectable homes and businesses. They were a source of shame for their families. The psychological toll must have been crushing. Every day, the person woke up with a physical reminder of their crime and their shame. Every interaction with another person was filtered through their disfigurement. They were no longer seen as a whole person, but as a collection of missing parts. A blinded man could hear the world but never see another human face. A man without a tongue could have thoughts but never speak them. A woman with a slit nose would see disgust in the eyes of others for the rest of her life. It was a life of profound isolation, and the message they carried was potent. It reinforced the social order. The lord in his castle and the bishop in his cathedral were safe. The law protected them. For the common person, the law was a much more fearsome thing. It could reach out and physically take a piece of you. The sight of a mutilated beggar reinforced this power dynamic. It told the common folk, this is our world, these are our rules, and this is the price for breaking them. The state didn't need posters or public service announcements. It had these broken people. In some cases, the mutilated person might even be required to wear a sign or a particular type of clothing to further advertise their crime. They were stripped of their old identity and given a new one: thief, liar, adulterer. This was their new role in society. They had been repurposed. They were no longer a farmer or a craftsman. They were now a tool of the state, a piece of living propaganda. Their personal suffering served a public function. Their life after the punishment was not their own. It belonged to the system that had broken them, a constant, silent sermon on the consequences of sin and crime. While mutilation was a common tool of the criminal justice system, its use was not limited to punishing common thieves and poachers. It was also a sophisticated weapon in the worlds of high politics and deep religious faith. The principles were the same, using the body to send a message, but the stakes were much higher. In the political arena, mutilation was a way to neutralize a rival without making them a martyr. Killing a political opponent, especially one with a legitimate claim to a throne, could be risky. It could spark a civil war or create a martyr that his followers would rally around. The mutilation offered a more cunning solution. According to the political theory in many places, like the Byzantine Empire, a king or emperor had to be physically whole. A perfect ruler needed a perfect body. An emperor who was disfigured was seen as unfit to rule. Blinding was the preferred method. A blinded man could not lead an army into battle. He could not project an image of power and authority. He was rendered helpless, dependent, and, most importantly, ineligible for the throne. So, when a rival claimant was captured, instead of a clean beheading, he might be dragged to a dark room and have his eyes put out. He was allowed to live, but his political life was over. He was a non-threat. His followers could not rally behind a man who was so visibly broken. It was a politically brilliant and humanly devastating tactic. It ended a bloodline's ambition without the stain of outright murder. Castration served a similar purpose. For a captured rival, it was the ultimate dynastic weapon. A castrated man could produce no heirs. His family line, his threat to the throne, ended with him. He could be left to live out his days in a monastery, his political ambitions rendered sterile along with his body. It was a way of pruning the family tree of a rival dynasty, ensuring that the threat was not just delayed, but eliminated for all future generations. But the pain was not always inflicted by others. In the realm of piety and religious devotion, some people chose to mutilate themselves. This was the world of extreme asceticism. Devout believers, seeking to purify their souls, saw the body as a source of sin and temptation. The flesh was weak, a distraction from the spiritual world. To achieve a higher state of holiness, they believed they had to conquer the body, to punish it, to bring it under the will of the spirit. This led to practices like self-flagellation. Monks and other devout individuals would whip their own backs with leather cords, sometimes embedded with pieces of metal, until they were bloody. The pain was a form of prayer, a way of sharing in the suffering of Christ. It was a physical act of repentance. They were deliberately scarring and breaking their own bodies to show their devotion to God. In more extreme cases, some men, inspired by a literal interpretation of a Bible verse, would castrate themselves to remove sexual temptation once and for all. This was seen as the ultimate act of sacrificing the flesh for the sake of the soul. While the official church often condemned such extreme practices, the impulse behind them was understood. It came from the same core belief that shaped judicial mutilation. The body is a symbolic space. It can be written upon, disciplined, and altered to reflect a deeper truth. For the state, that truth was the law. For the devout, that truth was the word of God. So you see, the act of cutting, burning, and removing parts of the human body was woven deep into the fabric of medieval life. It was a tool for judges to maintain order. It was a weapon for kings to secure power. And it was a path for saints to find salvation. In all its forms, it was a recognition of the body's immense symbolic power. It was a brutal, physical dialogue about crime, power, and faith, conducted in a language of pain and scars. It reminds us of a time when justice, politics, and religion were not abstract concepts, but forces that could literally get under your skin.